Good morning, everybody, and thank you for that lovely and very frightening introduction. So, my session this morning, I'm going to be talking about the relationship between knowledge, subjects, literacy, and inclusion. Knowledge, subjects, literacy, and inclusion. And I want to explore and illustrate how those are profoundly connected. And I'm going to start with a great indulgence. I'm going to start by reading you a story. It might seem like a slightly mad thing to do, but I think you'll see why just one story will do quite a lot of work in illustrating what I want to do. So here we go. We're going to go into the 8th century, and we're going to go into the early Muslim world, and we're going to go to the founding of the city of Baghdad. So, are you sitting comfortably? At 2 o'clock on the 30th of July, in the year 762 of the Common Era, a great Muslim ruler called Al-Mansur was standing near the river Tigris holding a large brick. His advisors, his many servants, and his clever architects all stood near him. An expectant hush fell over the crowd. All along the banks of the Tigris, thousands of workmen looked on. Everyone watched. Everyone waited. Then, carefully, Al-Mansur laid the brick in its special place. The building of the new city had begun. Al-Mansur had dreamed about building this city. It would be his new capital of the Muslim world, the city of Baghdad. It was such a special moment that Al-Mansur had special coins made to mark the occasion. Al-Mansur had asked his architects to design a round city. He wanted his city to be a perfect circle. The architects made 4 big gates into the circular city. Can you find them? Until now, Baghdad had been just a tiny village. People had settled there when the Persians were ruling, but now the Muslim Arabs had conquered these lands. Al-Mansur was their caliph. Al-Mansur was determined to be the greatest caliph ever. A great caliph needed a great city with fine palaces and beautiful mosques. He needed a city that would be famous throughout the lands that the Arabs had conquered. Al-Mansur could therefore take no chances. He needed to know that his city would be the best. Now, Arab peoples often studied the stars. Like the Persian peoples that they had conquered, the Arabs believed the stars could guide them. So Al-Mansur consulted his royal astrologers. The astrologers studied the stars to work out the best time to build the city. It was the astrologers who told Al-Mansur that July the 30th, 762 at 2 o'clock was exactly the right time to build. But Al-Mansur was still worried. What if the architects have got the plan wrong? What would the city really look like? How could he be sure that it would be wonderful? So, Al-Mansur ordered his architects to do one more thing before building could start. He told them to mark out the entire city on the ground with a trail of cotton seeds. Oil was then poured onto the seeds were set alight, and suddenly the vast plan of the city was marked out in a great circle of fire. Al-Mansur could now see what his city would look like in a giant plan made of flames. What a sight it must have been. At last, Al-Mansur was happy. One observer recorded him saying, "By God, I will live in this city all my life. It will be my descendants' home. It will be the richest city in the world." Al-Mansur was finally ready to lay that first brick. Sometimes when I'm doing training with primary teachers for my program, I ask a question, and it's a bit of a deceptive question. It's a trick question. I'm being a bit mean. I say, what makes that a good story for teaching history to year 5, which would be your primary 6? And they come back with the things that skilled teachers will come back with around the nature and structure of story. They point out the role of delay and suspense, that we don't know what's going to happen, that holds your attention. They talk about the richness of the detail and the way in which that takes you and gives you a sense of place, and so on and so forth. And they talk about the vividness of that image of the circle of fire, one of the most famous stories in early, an iconic story in the story of early Islam. And they pick out all of those things and say, well, yes, I could see myself really using that story. I could read it with them, I can tell it to them, and so on. But they're missing the point. Because yes, all those things are absolutely true. You do need to write the story well. It does need to have those elements of delay. It's what holds our attention, not knowing what's coming. We do need to paint those worlds richly. That world building does a huge amount of work in history. We learned a great deal very efficiently there about values, ideas, customs, beliefs, and technology. The technology they had, the way in which, without, CAD/CAM and certainly without AI and without computers, how did they try to see a plan of the city? They made this circle of fire with what they had. Fire was central to their technology and the cotton seeds. All of this, we can get to all of those points with the teachers, but they're still missing the point. Because what really makes it possible for our year fives to read that text with ease and with delight, what makes it possible to include all children and to understand it, even those tricky references to the Persians, or that funny word, the river Tigris, or those expressions, the Muslim world, what does that mean? All of those things are packed with meaning for these children. And why? Well, because of the curriculum. So there's Baghdad on our curriculum. We do it as part of our early Islamic civilizations, the third and final unit that we do on that. We do it at the beginning of our year 5, your primary 6. But what is it that has so altered the children's eyes and ears that they are seeing things that maybe you wouldn't have seen and felt in that story? And by seen, I don't mean sort of consciously noticed, but unconsciously. Their brains would process certain things because of their prior knowledge. Let's take a look at a few examples. Well, clearly all the stuff about the Arab conquests, which is why it's safe to allude to the Muslim world or talk about caliphs or beautiful mosques. It's going to make sense because we've done systematic work on that. We're revisiting it. That's obvious. But it's not just that. This territory around the river Tigris at the heart of Mesopotamia is the territory that was conquered by Alexander the Great. Year 5 have been here before. And they're used to conquerors coming along wanting this fertile territory. They're used to it. They're fascinated by the fact that here we are again. We're by the river Tigris again. It's recognition, not unfamiliarity, at the opening of that story. And what about much earlier when we did ancient Mesopotamia? Again, the river Tigris, a cradle of civilization. But it's not just that. If we then move forward in our Baghdad unit, think for a moment, why are we choosing to study Baghdad? I mean, why pack that into a primary curriculum on top? We've already done something on early Islamic civilizations at the end of year 4. Why do we have to do Baghdad as well? Well, because we're drilling down into more depth and more richness on the same broad topic, but also because we're thinking forwards about what that knowledge of Baghdad is going to do to transform things, not only in year 6, but in secondary. Baghdad is going to be fundamental to accessing huge amounts of European history. It's going to be critical to making sense of the Renaissance, of how ideas about mathematics and science and technology and philosophy and geography and map making were developed by the Arabs in Baghdad, rescuing some of the knowledge of the ancient world, those collapsed empires, and how this was going to feed forward. So I don't want the children encountering that cold when they get to secondary. I want them to arrive with that richness, that complexity. So I'm going to build it in. And what, therefore, if we're going to go to that when we get into Baghdad and we're going to study all those extraordinary and thrilling stories about how the caliphs sent out scholars, translators, to brave hell and high water to find those lost manuscripts of the ancient Greeks, and who knows, maybe they'll find it. Maybe they'll find the one precious treasure that nobody can find. And that is a full, complete copy of the greatest mathematics textbook ever, Euclid. It's packed with stories which are quite thrilling. But what makes it extra thrilling for the children is the fact that they're arriving knowing about two things in particular: the work on mathematics of the ancient Greeks, but also the work on the mathematics from the Indus Valley, the number systems, positional notation that we also got from that territory. The children are going to encounter these again in another setting. The subject itself, if you follow its natural contours, is profoundly coherent. If we're cumulative like this, then nothing feels like overload because everything is connected to everything else. The world is big, but in a way the world is small because the topics and places are connected. We return to the river Tigris. We don't go to a river on Mars. So that's only part of the story. What about being able to read this story? Because as well as the teacher telling it freely, it would be quite nice for the children to be able to read it. And after all, even if the teacher reads it aloud to the children, which is what we do after they've learned their new vocabulary, we want the children then to do various activities with it. We want them to think with it. We want them to do some disciplinary historical thinking. So I do need them to read this story and to read it on their own and read it at their own pace and make meaning. Can they read it? Well, of course they can. All the words in bold have been taught this lesson. And when I say taught, I mean really taught, super thoroughly. They've said each one at least 20 times in lots of really fun oral, choral response and a lot of clever Q&A. They've practiced the pronunciation. They've wrapped their tongues and lips around it. They've said those new words, architect. They've said it to the ceiling, they've said it to the floor, they've said it in their angry voice, they've said it in their mysterious voice, and so on. Those are the words in bold. So we've had fun, really inclusive whole class teaching to make sure they're secure. But what about all the words that are not in bold? Because there aren't very many in bold. Don't introduce many new words each lesson. All the words that are not in bold have already been taught. And that's not difficult because the subject is connected. So River Tigris, I've already mentioned. References to Muslim world and Muslim Arabs, I've already mentioned. But what about some of these other more tier 2 words? Not technical words relating to this aspect of history, just good tier 2 vocabulary. And some deceptively simple words like city, which actually may not make meaning for some children, perhaps if they've lived in a rural area. And a concept of an ancient city is different from a modern city. So even the deceptively simple words need prior curricular work if I'm to give all children access to them. And by access, I mean a sense of resonance when they hear the word use. I mean, when they hear that word, it just conjures a constellation of images in the child's head. So there's those. And then there's sort of more technical expressions, mark the occasion. They've learnt that in geography last term. I'm deliberately reusing it because they learned it in geography last term. And what about all the disciplinary work they've done, understanding how historians work? I can afford to casually throw in historians have been able to work out. We can go on and do the same job with the same sorts of things on the next page. But I want to point out something else. Now do you see why Year 5's eyes are going to light up when they read that first paragraph? He wanted his city to be a perfect circle. Because of my curriculum, I can guarantee that every child, long before we've said anything, and I'm going to leave them in suspense for at least 3 lessons, every single child's been going, what? Do you mean, did they have a copy? Did they have a copy of Euclid? Wait and see, Year 5. Isn't that curriculum? In a way, story is analog for curriculum. It's wait and see. You're constantly planting. It's like a great Netflix series or a film or the last novel or the last Netflix series you binge watched. It's all about delay and what's coming next. But it works through thinking about the prior knowledge that is rendering the new thing accessible, but also rendering the new thing fascinating. Any other reader is not going to notice that expression. Well, it's quite interesting. Cities made of perfect circles, that's quite interesting. No, that's much more packed with meaning if you've studied ancient Greek mathematics. Those words that I outlined then in red are tier 2 words which we don't have to learn them in history, we can learn them in any number of subjects. a steady broadening of words that you might not pick up in your everyday, say, family context. They are what we go to school for, to give us a richer, more powerful vocabulary that allows us to describe the world, to explain the world, to analyze the world, and ultimately to change the world. That analytic vocabulary that subjects give us. And it's through humanities subjects, sciences, and the arts that we gradually, bit by bit, get that broader and broader and broader, quite technical, abstract vocabulary of an educated person. And that means that when we read any text, like this little bit of fiction that I've put up here, actually our knowledge of humanities and science and arts is transformational. And this is why it's a terrible false economy to say, oh, well, I'm going to do less humanities, sciences, and arts because we need to practice reading comprehension. I mean, when we look at so much research on reading comprehension training and the quite limited effect that it has, relatively speaking, and you look at the colossal effect and the evidence for it of wide knowledge on literacy, you can see that precisely in the interests of literacy, you want to teach shed loads of humanities, sciences, and arts, because that's where the vocabulary is going to come from and in context. And of course, we're reading texts as we do it. This is a piece of children's historical fiction. Some of you may recognize it. And if I showed this in England, it would sort of create a quite groan across the hall and a slight shudder of nervousness, of sort of trauma, because it's a memory of the 2016 SATS tests. We don't have transfer tests, as you know, but we do have a test when they go into secondary in reading and writing and mathematics. And this was the first of the new style tests. And actually, there are 3 passages that children have to read and do lots of fiddly comprehension questions on them. And this particular test in 2016 caused an absolute outcry. I can still remember Twitter on that day. There was weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth. What planet did you find children on that could possibly read this? But the tragedy is, if you look back now, through what we know about the research, about the relationship with background knowledge and reading, and also with the hindsight of the shifts that we've had in England, which came later with a shift in our inspection, where there was much more emphasis on the wider curriculum, it's absolutely shocking that any primary principal thought a child, the vast, vast majority of children, just a very few, perhaps with very particular needs accepted, but the vast majority of children, including most with special educational needs, it's shocking that they would not have had extensive, detailed, thorough, embedded and repeated practice in every single one of these words purely by teaching history. I'm going to take history as my example as we're in there and with limited time. Let's just look at it. I'll read that second paragraph for us. Glancing nervously behind her, Maria suggested that they row out to the island in the middle of the lake. Oliver looked at her questioningly. Maria explained that there was a secret monument on the island to one of her ancestors. This was a woman who'd married a prince at the time when there was a struggle for the throne. The struggle had been between 2 rival families. One had a lion as its symbol. The winner had a bear. Come on, Maria said impatiently. Now, I quite often do an exercise in England or when I'm working with communities that are starting to use my programme and just say, can you pick out the nouns and noun phrases that some children would struggle with, perhaps in your school? And we quickly build a list, as I'm sure that you can. And here I've colour-coded them. I've started to classify them by thinking about these particular words in relation to the subject of history. And you can see 2 themes, can't you, emerging? So in the reddish-brown theme, my theme there is how did rulers before democracy, and democracy, remember, is a very young and fragile plant on our planet, for the vast bulk of human history, how did ruling people pass on their power? And power usually meant land. Well, the answer is through family, through marriage. And then look at the blue words. Well, for the vast bulk of human history, most people have not been literate. So how did rulers communicate with their followers? How did they frighten people, encourage people, persuade people, tell people they were great and powerful? Well, through the visual, through the physical, through the great monument in the desert, through the symbol on the flag, through the carving on the stately home. So that's my second theme then. How did rulers display their power? A history curriculum, a primary history curriculum, when children have been in school for 7 years, that had not got children so used to these themes and used to the range of vocabulary it throws up, would be a very poor history curriculum, because it would be missing something really fundamental to history. Let me express it now in a more curricular way. Rulers passing on their power, and I put a bit more vocabulary up there that you would expect to encounter: family, dynasty, house. And on the right, rulers displaying their power. And oh, look, when they're displaying their power, what are they banging on about? Their families. The two themes are connected. Subjects themselves are internally coherent. They are powerful constellations that are connected. And we follow the rhythms and patterns of that subject to get the benefit of that coherence, to use that coherence to allow the new thing to make sense in the light of the old thing. But if I were to ask you now, if we take any one of those words, where does that word, or indeed that noun phrase, struggle for the throne, live in your head? Where does it live in your head? If you think for a moment, I don't think any of us in this room would say that it lives in our head in a dictionary definition. None of us reached for a dictionary definition of monument or ancestor. Somehow, as if by magic, you knew instantly what it meant at an extraordinary speed. Within a microsecond, you process that word. You would if it was on its own, and you do in the context of a text, which further makes you process it. So that word doesn't live in our heads in a dictionary definition, though we could probably find one there or make one up. So where does it live? Well, I would say it lives in 100 stories and 100 images. That's where it lives. Probably 1,000 stories and 1,000 images. A tremendous richness sits under the extraordinary, I mean, it's remarkable. We can hardly take it in, the extraordinary speed with which a literate human being makes meaning out of one of those words. It's the richness underneath that means that your understanding of monument and your understanding of throne is both precise and flexible. It's both precise and fertile. It's kind of almost got a promiscuous protean quality to it. It can change its meaning, but you know which meaning it is because you've got such richness stored in your long-term memory. So I've put that in a kind of everyday-ish way. Let's now put it in a more scientific way, because we can express that scientifically through our talking about prototypes and schema. And I always think it's worth going back to some quite early research on this by Eleanor Roche. She was fascinated by why it is that people can read, and why, at the sheer speed of reading, the speed in which a person who is fluent in reading can make sense of it. And we're talking here, obviously, after phonics and decoding have been mastered, right? I'm talking about making meaning from the word. So take that piece as read, and Ruth will be talking about that a lot to us this afternoon. So Eleanor Roche established, and just sum it up very crudely here, established that those who read fluently, in other words, those who read fast, because you can't be fluent unless you're fast, those who read fluently, their brains, as it were, don't latch on to a particular meaning of one of those tier 2 or T3 words. They kind of go down a level of generality, below any dictionary definition, to zillions of little examples that sit underneath. And from that multitude of examples, we form what she called the prototype for that word, a kind of single ideal type for what that word is. And that speed of recognition is dependent on the range of examples you've got. So your prototype will be fertile and precise, flexible and precise, if it is underpinned by lots and lots of examples, lots of richness. But you can see where I'm going this. If you haven't got a lot of examples and richness, then you may not understand the word at all, or if you do, you'll have a narrow, rigid concept of it, which will get in the way. She began her examples, her experiments with the word bird, which was very interesting. Just think of the range of birds. When I'm doing training, I get teachers to stop and we just think of all the birds we can think of. And even though probably very few ornithologists in the room, it's amazing how many birds we know. And that just in a very concrete way illustrates the point that we're not flummoxed if a bird turns out to be a chicken or an emu or an ostrich or a robin. just the sheer richness. And then when you get into the abstract words, the words that give children power, like symbol, you start to see the significance of this and the importance of that breadth of knowledge coherently held. And then when you get to a really interesting word like institution, which I really think in some ways is like a mark of an educated person, you really see its power. The exercise I give teachers at this point when I'm doing this in a workshop and I've got lots of time is to get them, and I let them spend about 3 or 4 minutes on this, just thinking of as many examples of institutions as they can. And when they've gone beyond the obvious, and I mean concrete examples, I say, don't define it, just give me examples. And they've exhausted Royal Society of Chemistry, St Matthew's Church, the BBC, the EU, off they go. Family, marriage, keep going. No, go on, go on, go on. And then someone will say, Judi Dench, or David Attenborough, Mrs. Jones, who retired recently in our school, who taught in our school for 30 years. Mrs. Jones, she's an institution. And the ripple of laughter goes around the room. And then I say, look at that incredible shared knowledge that feeds metaphor as well. What a word. And you know when to use the word institution and when to use the word organization, and you know they're not necessarily the same. You know that an institution is sometimes a building, but not always. What an astonishing amount of knowledge. And where does that come from? It absolutely does not and cannot come from endless, tedious practice in inference and comprehension exercises. It is not actually a skill. It comes from prior knowledge. And this starts to explain the role of knowledge, the astonishingly empowering role of knowledge for literacy, but also for the ability to think. And I just want to share a kind of pull things together here at this moment and sum this up by saying that the principle here, which is a principle that works for background knowledge in relation to literacy, the psychological structure of background knowledge that I've just explained, and literacy, actually is also true of all learning. And it's this, that the specific sits underneath the general. I cannot really learn about a sonata or a sonnet if I just learn a definition of a sonata or a sonnet. I probably do need a definition somewhere in the mix. But what will make that learning stick and endure and feel powerful is the range of sonatas and sonnets that I have bathed in. And through that precision, yet that flexibility starts to stick. I could show you plenty of other examples of texts. I'm going to give you, we're not going to look at this, but I just want to show it to you sort of graphically. Here is the third and final test that was in that 2016 test that made head teachers furious back in 2016. And you can't really classify this subject-wise. And therefore, it's quite a good one to think about. It's a general reading text. It's very well written. It's got a beautiful sort of dark humor to it. But it's about a very sad thing, which is how the dodo became extinct and how scientists, artists, and historians effectively worked together to discover it had become extinct. So this is history, science, art, RE, and geography, shed loads of geography. I think there's only one word in this text where I could say, yeah, I could see why a good primary curriculum might not have got to that word. And it's the word rehabilitate. I actually don't think, I couldn't find rehabilitate in my own primary humanities curriculum. So fair enough, but that doesn't matter. Because more recent cognitive science tells us that provided we all know 97% of the words in a text, we can read it and we can work out that remaining 3% through inference. It goes wrong when it's more than 3%. And for most children, most of the time, they're struggling because it's more than 3%. So why should all children, if they've had a really rich curriculum, be able to read this text? Why was it tragic that in 2016, many principals were complaining children couldn't read it, but had narrowed their history, their geography, their science, and their RE down so much because they were practicing reading comprehension? Let's look at it. That's the history vocab, basic. You'd have mastered most of that by the end of year 4 in a good curriculum. That's the geography vocab. That's the RE vocab, paradise, sacrifice. And that is the science vocab in blue. There's hardly anything left. So let's just complete the picture of the cognitive science. It's not just prototypes. All of those examples are bound together in a web, a network, or as the great cognitive scientist Anderson called it, a schema. And these schema live in our long-term memory, not our short-term working memory that can only take in maximum of 7 new things, but they live in our long-term memory. And we understand from the cognitive science too that when our mind, when our eye, our ear alights upon a word, when we first hear that word monument or sacrifice or offering, and those are words that we heard in the that were in the Dodo passage too, sacrifice and offering. The moment our eye lands on that word in a text or hears it in a story or explanation, an extraordinarily fast two-way process goes on in our brains, testing for fit against all the possible meanings of those words. Testing for fit, back and forth, testing for fit. Is it that meaning of monument? Is it that meaning of monument? Is it that one? It's testing for fit. In a microsecond, we are not aware that it is happening. It is simply the work of knowledge. So the schema of a child who grasps the meaning of a phrase, struggle for the throne, or the dodo was effectively offering himself up as a sacrifice because all the other animals came in from the explorers and killed it. The child who grasps the phrase offered up as a sacrifice, or the child who grasps the phrase struggle for the throne, speedily has a schema around throne or sacrifice that looks perhaps like that. And you can see on the right the problem for the child who's just not got enough examples to get a word of that richness. So if we take a passage from the Dodo one, I'm just going to show you a little bit there. Curious and unafraid, the animals of Mauritius offered themselves up for slaughter. Of course they didn't. This is a bit of the humour, it's a bit of the metaphor this writer is using. What a series of complex moves the brain has to make to get that. This is an offering, which children should know well from their ancient history, from their study of religion. The word crops up all the time. But they've then got to grasp, haven't they, that this is clearly not meant to be literal. The animals of Mauritius offered themselves up for slaughter. There are certain things that need to be taken for granted here. It's not a moment where you want to be saying, if you were teaching with that text, oh, does anyone know what offering means? And going back to scratch with it. The background knowledge has to do the work. I had a go at coming up with what might be in my schema for the word sacrifice. And it was impossible, really. I let one word trigger another. I chucked down the word religion first. That triggered altar. Maybe I was thinking of ancient Roman sacrifices. That triggered blood, and on I went. I ended up, after a while, in Christianity. Then I ended up in some general morality. Heaven knows what's in my schema for sacrifice, or yours, but it'll be rich. But here's the last point about schema. And I call it magic. But that is very naughty of me because it's not magic, it's science, but it feels like magic because it's so lovely. And that is this. The reason we can read at speed when we've only got space for 7 new things in our working memory, and of course 7 new things in our working memory is a bit of a problem in reading because there's usually more than 7 words in a line or 7 words in a sentence. So how do we glide along making meaning at speed? Well, what the cognitive scientists have shown us, the reason is if your schemata are good enough, if you've got enough knowledge that has led to this secure vocabulary, then what happens is our brains chunk, they clump together, they cluster together all the data that's coming in to our brains through our senses. And in this instance, it's words on a page or maybe words in our ear. They clump and cluster it all together as one thing. And so it only takes up one precious space in those 7 new things and not 7, leaving space for more words. And that's why we're able to read as gist rather than list. The lists become gist effectively through this clumping, clustering process. So you and I'm quite sure your brains clumped or clustered Married a Prince. You read it as one. Struggle for the throne, 2 rival families. It took up 1 space in your working memory and not 3 or 4. So what does all this mean for curriculum? Probably obvious already, but let me just take an example now of a word not quite as hard as institution, but nonetheless, a word children stumble on and continue to stumble on, even into secondary. If you don't understand this word, or you can't call it up when you need it, and you accidentally call up a near neighbour like ruler or parliament. If you don't understand all its various cognates, if you don't understand about governing or governance, you can have a problem understanding a huge range of general texts and texts in different subjects. So I take that as an example of a measure of a strong primary curriculum. The primary curriculum has given you the knowledge to make that piece of vocabulary fluent. So, what made it fluent? Well, maybe at Key Stage 1 we told great stories. Perhaps we told stories about a Tudor monarch and a schema built up around that. And maybe we chose our stories well. So we got a sense that a ruler, surprisingly, can't do exactly what they want. They have to control other powerful people, and we told good stories to make sure that it did do that. And we learned that rulers usually have counsellors or advisors helping them. So we get that paraphernalia around ruling. Then maybe somewhere in Key Stage 2, we come across a governor of a province of ancient Rome. What does he do? Oh, look. He does some of the same things that the Tudor monarch does. But it looks different and feels different, and he does other things too. And then we might come across a pharaoh of ancient Egypt. He does, oh, that's different. That's different from the other ones. So similarity and difference, all learning, it works through spotting similarity and difference, spotting similarity and difference. And let me close the loop now with the Baghdad extract at the start. What's that going to add about what it means to be a ruler in general? What's it going to feed into this ever-shifting, changing meaning-making around that word government, getting it secure? Well, through its diversity, and a diverse curriculum is a friend of schema for obvious reasons, what's it going to do? Struggles to throw off other Muslim rulers, choosing a site for a capital city, patterns of being a patron of culture and the arts, a concern for true religion in his subjects. And so we start to see, in effect, the children don't need a map like this. But I would argue that that's not only unnecessary, it might be a waste of time. But the knowledge itself does the work. Because by the end of year 6, we want to be doing really interesting stuff to do with our historical thinking and questioning. And we really, really can now, because we've got a vocabulary to access it and a vocabulary to think with. So, just pulling the threads together around literacy, it's all about speed. Those word associations need to be available immediately if pupils are to avoid working memory overload. Let's go back to that for just a moment. What cognitive science tells us is that all of those possible meanings need to be available in the brain, even though only one is going to be important in this moment. They all need to be available. And that two-way process, our brains have to access it fast. So it's all about speed. There's a wonderful quotation here about the background knowledge and reading, which E.D. Hirsch used. And I just think it's a brilliant summary of the psychological structure of background knowledge and reading. Listen to this and picture any of your children who are struggling with reading in the upper primary years. The limits of short-term memory do not allow the integration of unchunked material. So crucial parts of meaning are lost to memory while other parts are being painstakingly worked out. In this process, speed of comprehension is equivalent to quality of comprehension, because without the speed and the shorthand provided by well-organized schemata, our circuits get overloaded. And that is what is going on so much. The circuits are being overloaded, and we're trying to solve them with very limited effect interventions, such as comprehension skills. I stress again that clearly the phonics piece needs to be sorted first. I'm not talking about decoding here, but once you've mastered that, once you've understood that, the crucial thing is to read a general text, as the more modern cognitive scientist Daniel Willingham tells us. To read a general text, we need knowledge that is 2 miles wide and 2 inches deep. Don't be put off by the 2 inches deep. He's not suggesting shallow knowledge there. He's simply making the point that knowledge must be broad if we're to get the rich vocabulary of an educated person. So, vocabulary size is the outward and visible sign of an inward acquisition of knowledge. But if vocabulary is the outward and visible sign of an inward acquisition of knowledge, it is also a very reliable correlate for social class. So let's just turn to that other aspect of inclusion. Why does this matter so much for disadvantaged pupils? Various research has been done refining the original famous study that I'm sure you all know of Hart and Risley back in 2003. And it's quite a small sample, actually. It was just 42 families that were looked at. But nonetheless, the broad pattern is very, very clear. By age 3, for many, not all, for many children, the gap between the highly advantaged and the less advantaged is vast. But I always think Hart and Risley's research is interesting for another reason, and indeed subsequent things that have looked at the word gap. And I think it's the fact that it's not just the number of words they'd heard, it's the range of words they'd heard. And the gap is also true in the degree of abstraction in the word. So no prizes for guessing which children might be more likely to come across a word like monument, establishment, institution, or sacrifice in the home setting. So when we think about children coming in age 3, 4, 5 with this deficit, what is school for? If school is about equity, if it is about equity, we cannot surely, we do not dare say, you're a lower attainer, I'm going to give you less vocabulary, because you're going to make the gap wider and wider and wider by the second. And you're going to leave that children without power to describe and analyze the world, to argue with the world, to argue with us. So that's why a curriculum needs to be very careful. We need adaptive teaching to support children with a range of needs, but we need to be very wary about differentiating by curricular input, because curricular input gives us common knowledge. There are other studies too, different sorts of studies, sociological studies, such as this one, the astonishing effect of when France removed its common curriculum back in 1989. You look 18 years later at what was happening to the literacy of 16-year-olds in deprived and marginalized communities. It's quite terrifying. They did not have the common knowledge to have the vocabulary to read. So, my big punchline is this: common knowledge, knowledge we share so fast that it allows us to share a joke. Knowledge we share so fast that it allows us to interpret is a fresh way of thinking about inclusion. And I like to think about that common knowledge in 2 ways. Common knowledge in the classroom, the common knowledge that allows every child to take part in the debate, the common knowledge that allows every child to enjoy the discussion, the common knowledge that allows every child to access the text because it's been so carefully prepared. But ultimately, the point is the common knowledge that allows our common life, that allows civic life, that allows us to disagree agreeably, that allows us to live together in community, in a nation. Common knowledge is a fresh way of thinking about inclusion. I'm going to summarize so far what I've said about schema, because it's critically important. So often people look at that and think, oh yeah, I get it. But we forget that it is the schema that's enabling this. And look at the red summary there. The schema changes how we perceive all new information. And that doesn't just mean I can recognize and access it, it means I'm interested in it. It's why I get bored quite quickly when I'm watching rugby, because I don't understand it. So the accessibility of a schema, how quickly it comes to mind, in other words, influences that tiny window of attention that is our short-term memory that we can give to any new information. It's about noticing. It fundamentally affects our brains noticing. And this chunking, too, that schema achieves 3 things. If you look at the 3 points in that final sentence, This chunking frees up working memory to, 1, take in the new content, the new science, the new music, whatever. 2, take in the flow of the text, the narrative, the argument. And 3, it frees up working memory to think about what is being apprehended. So the result of this, we must be thorough. We must be thorough in our curriculum design if we're going to give access to all children and get as yet unknown excellence in all children. And also, not something I focused on today, we must be thorough in our teaching and get them secure in that vocabulary in the first place. Thank you all very much.